Hey guys, Dr. Joel Seedman here. In today's video, I'm going to give you 25 quick facts and tips to help you lock in your core training. Point number one, the most important cue I give everyone when it comes to locking in their core is you have to pull your stomach in tight while simultaneously bracing your abs like someone is punching you in the stomach. We want to do those two things maximally, stomach in and brace. Point number two, posture is very important when it comes to maximizing your core positioning and core activation. If my head is tall, my shoulders are retracted, and I have good posture, my core muscles will naturally engage as they should. If I'm slouched, I have poor posture, my head is forward, these muscles in my abs and core will be disengaged. So we want to focus on posture and core because they work together in tandem. Point number three, you got to make sure your lats are engaged. If your lats are not engaged, your shoulders are going to be elevated. It's going to disengage your core. You're not going to be able to fire your abs like you need to. Activate those lats, pull the shoulders down and back, then you'll really be able to find your core as well as your glutes and the other muscles around your hips. Point number four, related to what we just talked about with point number three, keep those shoulders down and back. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people elevate their shoulders when they're trying to engage their abs and when they're doing all their crunches and different core exercises. You will not be able to engage your abs at all if the shoulders are up and elevated and rolled forward. Pull them down and back, then you can find your core. Point number five, this is one of the most important things. I've talked about it in other videos, full body tension and full body stiffness. This is absolutely critical and it's directly related to core activation because if you're having trouble finding those core muscles and those deep abs, just focus on creating maximal full body tension, maximal bracing from head to toe, and I can almost guarantee you those core muscles are going to engage. Point number six, you need to find a balance between the anterior side of my body, the front, and the posterior back side of my body. A lot of folks have trouble with this. They either have too much tension on the front side where they're crunching so hard and bracing their abs and letting their shoulders round forward, and then you have the flip side of that where people try to pull their shoulders back so much and keep their chest out that they disengage their abs. You want to have a balance, and that balance lies in pulling the shoulders down and back like we've already mentioned, while simultaneously bracing the abs and pulling the stomach in. They have to happen together. Point number seven, you don't need a weightlifting belt. I don't use them, my athletes don't use them, you don't need them. It's a garbage training tool that allows you to get away with compensation patterns. Ditch the belt. Point number eight, there are actually 8 categories of core and ab work that you can include in your training. We have spinal flexion, that would be something like a crunch. We have spinal extension, something like a back extension. We also have lateral flexion of the spine, like a side bend. And then we have rotational movements like medicine ball exercises or chops with a cable. We also have the 4 anti-versions or anti-movements of those same 4 that I just mentioned. So basically with all those 8, you can hit the core pretty effectively, and you should probably try to include all 8 of those in your core training at some point. I'm going to have another video on this detailing more specifics of how to train all of those 8 categories in another video. Point number 9, focus more on the transverse abs and not as much on the rectus abs. We have the rectus abs, which are basically those 6-pack muscles on the top of the abs and the core. Those are the muscles that we normally like to see, the beach muscles. But under those, we have those deep muscles of the core, those transverse abs. And those are responsible for stabilizing the spine and providing that structural integrity so that everything is locked in and stable. So movements like planks or exercises like planks, single arm planks, renegade rows, where you're performing isometric movements of the core and you're resisting either rotation or resisting extension. That's where those all-important transverse abs are going to be worked. Point number 10. This one is a bit tricky and even somewhat controversial. You have 2 fields of thought when it comes to core training. On one side, we have the group that focuses more on stiffness of the spine, and then the other side of that for that rotational element of the spine, and they tend to veer away from stiffness. I actually believe in both sides of this. I'm not for one or opposed to one. I include both in my training, but in all actuality, I think it's a combination of the 2 concepts that works best. By optimizing our level of stiffness in the spine and having a very rigid core and really activating those deep core muscles, what ends up happening is I create optimal levels of rotation in my body. If my spine is not stiff, I can have excessive rotation. So optimal levels of spinal stiffness prevents excessive rotation. It creates optimal rotation as I transmit force from my hips to my upper body and vice versa. Point number 12. Don't overemphasize spinal flexion. Spinal flexion would be exercises like crunches or sit-ups, kind of the traditional ab exercises. And the reason I say this is because most folks are stuck in poor posture, oftentimes from sitting or just from modern society, the way we work and the way we have developed poor posture. And with that comes this rounded shoulders and forward head tilt, and we already have too much spinal flexion. So I always recommend don't do too much spinal flexion in your training. We want to focus a bit more on keeping that spine neutral. And along those same lines, we're going to move to point 13, and this deals with proper form for a crunch. A crunch is a lot more abbreviated in terms of the range of motion than you would think. And if you want to test this out for yourself, try laying on the ground or on a bench and performing a crunch in a super slow fashion. So instead of just kind of using momentum to pull yourself up, keep your head still, brace your abs, and then perform a slow crunch. Take about 5 seconds to move into that spinal flexion, and you'll see just how far your spine can move. It's a much more abbreviated position than you think. However, you'll feel your abs contract a lot more than if you went further. Point 14. Every exercise, if it's done properly, is technically a core exercise. I know that sounds a bit cliche and cheesy, but it's actually true. If you know how to fire your core and engage it, it should really be activated fully on just about every exercise you do. And related to that, point 15, if you find your core on the big 7 movement patterns, if you perform the big 7 movements with proper technique, which is the squat, hinge, lunge, horizontal push and pull, vertical push and pull. If you do those correctly, you're not going to actually have to include as much additional core training as you need to, because your core is actually getting worked on pretty much every exercise you do. But again, this goes back to proper technique, using the 90-degree positions. If you're doing that, you're inevitably going to be firing your core a lot, and you won't have to include a whole bunch of additional core exercises in your training. Point 16. This one is also a bit controversial. People often talk about squeezing your glutes to help prevent your spine from overarching. I've not found that to be the best cue for a lot of athletes, because what I've seen is it causes the hips to collapse forward too much. What I found is a better cue is just telling them to pull their abs in as much as they possibly can, and then that anterior pelvic tilt, if they have that excessive low back arch or excessive lumbar extension, it actually gets pulled into neutral. Those glutes naturally engage as they should, and they don't have that excessive posterior tilt where their hips just collapse forward rather than having them directly stacked under their body. Point 17, yes, the cue of keeping the ribs pulled down and not letting that rib cage flare. It's important, but I've actually found that cueing athletes to keep their stomach pulled in tight, as we continue to mention, by keeping the stomach pulled in tight, it actually helps to prevent that excessive ab and rib cage flare. And when you use the rib cage flare, telling people to pull their rib cage in and down, I've seen that cause too much shoulder elevation and retraction, where they actually move into poor posture. So rather than focusing on avoiding the rib cage flare, focus more on just pulling the stomach in as hard as you can while keeping the shoulders down and back. Point 18. When we're talking about keeping a neutral spine, which is the position that we generally want to have on most movements, but within a neutral spine or having spinal neutrality, there will be a little bit of flexion and extension that's allowed, around 5 degrees plus or minus. And we can see that when we do movements like an overhead press. We might have a little bit more extension of the spine just naturally from the arms going overhead. And then when we do something like, say, a straight arm lat pull down, where we're really squeezing our lats and almost crunching our abs at the same time, you might see just a little bit of spinal flexion there, just the nature of the exercise, but it's all still within that spinal neutrality position. Point number 19, I want to give you my personal favorite core exercise. If I could only do one core movement or abdominal exercise, it would be the single arm plank like this, or variations that are similar but even more advanced, like a renegade row, where I'm actually holding a single arm plank while simultaneously doing something like a row. I can also do a shoulder raise. I can also do a bicep curl. It's really all inclusive when it comes to working the entire core because you're resisting extension of the spine, you're resisting rotation, you're resisting lateral flexion, and even some elements of the low back is getting work. So it's really hitting the entire core. All those rectus abs, the transverse abs, the obliques, and even the smaller muscles around the lumbopelvic hip complex. Point number 20. Focus on overloading the abs and using high quality, not focusing on quantity and excessive number of reps. A lot of folks, they hit their abs with hundreds of reps, almost these garbage reps because they're so focused on the number. They'll do 2 or 3 minute planks or even longer. But just like any other muscle, we want to overload with high intensity and high quality. So generally with my athletes, I take the approach that if they can hold it or do the exercise for longer than 20 or 30 seconds, we need to either use more weight or make it more intense or use a different variation. So if you're able to do a 2 or 3 minute plank, first off, you're probably not doing it correctly, but even if you are, stop doing a 2, 3, 4 minute plank and do something like a heavy weighted plank or a single arm plank. That's gonna be a lot more effective because just like any other muscle group, we really want to focus on growing it or creating hypertrophy of the abdominals. And the best way to do that is with overload and high quality, not just excessive number of reps. And it would be analogous to me telling someone, hey, go do 2 minutes of squats. That's not going to really do anything in terms of producing growth. Focus on heavy weight with high quality. That's going to get the job done. Point 21. If you don't feel your core engaging on basic core exercises like a plank or a renegade row, you're not in the right position and you're probably not doing it correctly because honestly, even just a body weight plank, I can get my abs to engage very intensely that even after 5 or 10 seconds, my abs are super activated and very engaged. So again, if you're doing a core exercise, you don't feel it, change your technique, make sure you're squeezing and fully engaging those abdominal muscles. Point 22, proper breathing affects the core. There's actually research on this showing that nasal breathing, which is the preferred way to breathe as opposed to mouth breathing, nasal breathing helps to activate the deeper muscles of the core, especially those diaphragm muscles. And when we breathe through the nose, not only are we having better oxygen utilization, but your posture is going to be better because it helps to activate the muscles around the jaw and those facial muscles, and that actually helps stack everything all the way down the kinetic chain. So if you want to really engage those core muscles to that next level, focus on nasal breathing and using proper breathing patterns. Point 23, always try to include at least one core dominant exercise every workout. Point 24, try to have your core somewhat engaged throughout the day. And this actually goes back to posture. I get this question a lot. People asking me, well, should I have good posture throughout the entire day? I know it's a little bit more aggressive with the posture position that we take when we exercise. So what should that look like just on a day-to-day kind of 24/7 or when I'm at work or standing or sitting? Generally speaking, if your core is strong and if you've trained it properly and you've worked on your posture, the deep core muscles will be semi-engaged and this will occur naturally. You won't have to force it, but we don't want those core muscles to be so shut off that it pulls our back into excessive extension and we sacrifice proper posture. So if your posture is off and your core is just totally disengaged, that's a bit of a problem. So we want a low level of natural core engagement, which will happen from just strengthening your core. And lastly, point number 25. Always try to include some type of core exercise either in between axial loaded movements or directly after an axial loaded movement. Axial loaded movements are exercises like squats, deadlifts, hinges, even heavy overhead presses. And all of those exercises have one thing in common. They all work the muscles around the low back and it directly loads the spine pretty aggressively. So by placing in a core exercise in between or directly after one of those movements, not only are you decompressing the spine, but you're helping to find this balance between both sides of the body, between the posterior side, which those muscles of the low back just got worked pretty aggressively on something like a squat or deadlift. So they might get a little bit stiff and tight directly after that set. Performing something like a core exercise where the opposite muscles, the anterior side of the body is working, it's going to create balance in terms of the tone of the backside muscles so they're not so stiff. So by firing these muscles of the core, it might actually help relax the backside muscles so those back muscles aren't as stiff. Hey guys, I'm excited to announce that my brand new book, Movement Redefined Fundamentals, is out and it's completely free. It's on my website, advancedhumanperformance.com, and it gives all the details of the 90-degree eccentric isometrics protocol, and it just gives all the fundamentals that you need to maximize your strength training and gain as much muscle as possible, as well as optimizing your joint health. So check it out. Again, it's completely free.